Great. Welcome all today. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon as we take a journey over the next several days to do some really good work and come together as community in the spirit of environmental justice and social justice. So I'm going to start with talking a little bit about land acknowledgements, why we want them, why we need them, and how you can help us to accomplish some of the goals we have from implementing land acknowledgements. Next slide, Mary. We're going to start with, recognizing that everybody in this online environment is on different land. I happen to be in San Bernardino. I'm with the organization called ChICCCAA, Chicano Indigenous Community for Culturally Conscious Advocacy and Action. We've been working since 2011, 2012 as a cooperative in the inland region. And we sit on Yahabiatam and Serrano, also known as San Manuel Band of Mission Indians. The photo you see here is actually a photo of an area called Chimney Rock, which is in the Lucerne Valley near Dry Rabbit Lake. And you'll see a link at the bottom. We're going to get to that at the end of my presentation, but if you want to copy down that link, some folks on our tech team are going to be putting it in the chat. Dry Rabbit Lake and Chimney Rock was the last official conflict between California settlers and native first people, indigenous people of these lands. And so it's very important that we kind of center the idea that we all sit, no matter where we are, on indigenous land. And that looks different depending on what time and what area you're talking about in terms of who were the first people on those lands. Next slide, Mary. So we want to start with three things first, acknowledging three things. One is a very strong understanding that there's a difference between first people and native people and indigenous people. Those are three different things. First people is commonly known as the first people that were known to occupy a specific piece of land. That's often pre-colonial, so we're talking about before 1492. But over different generations, different decades, different centuries sometimes, there have been different native peoples occupying different lands around our region and across the continent, across all the continents of the globe. So it's really important to understand that all land is indigenous to somebody. And a lot of the work that we're doing and we're asking you to do is to really connect with who are the indigenous people from the lands that you're on. In the photo here, you can see a wonderful group of youth from Huerta de Valle. You're going to be hearing from them later this weekend as they're going to be doing some presentations around the wellness area. But we have them holding a banner that recognizes just some of the indigenous native people and first people of this region, which are the Yuhabiatam, the Kuya, the Serrano, the Tangva, the Yuma, the Mojave, the Luceño, the Chimihuevi, the Kimuye, just to name a few. And there's many, many, many more. And as we know, depending on where you're situated, and you can use the link in the chat to try to figure that out for yourself, there is a lot of variation on who was on which land at what time. But it's really important to get down to understanding who were the first peoples. Next slide. And so we also want to acknowledge a certain thing when we talk about land acknowledgements. Often when you hear people talk about native people or first people, you'll hear it referred to in the past. These people used to eat this food, or these people used to live this way, or these people used to wear this type of clothing. When we have that in the past tense, it basically erases indigenous people, native people, and first people. And so we want to use the present tense and talk about people in the present, because all of these people still exist. Their relatives are still here, often in the same territory, sometimes in other territories as we talk about relocation, the Trail of Tears, different things that have happened on this continent that have displaced indigenous people from their land, which was very traumatic. But in addition to the trauma of actually being displaced, there's also the problem of being erased. And so we can combat that by doing land acknowledgements, by talking about indigenous, native, and first people in the present tense, not the past tense, and to understand the concepts of migration and how different folks may have moved around different communities at different times. sometimes due to weather, sometimes due to harvest, sometimes due to hunting patterns, sometimes due to trade and barter. Many, many reasons why people migrated across these lands. Myself, I'm a sixth generation Chicana Indígena. My family and relatives have originated from the area of Guanajuato and Chihuahua in Mexico, but they migrated across Mexico to Arizona, New Mexico, California in a circle, and would go back and forth across that region according to the seasons. So in the picture, you'll see an acknowledgement of Chica, because we do a lot of that work helping Chicano, Brown, Black, Indigenous youth reconnect with the actual tribal people of their ancestors, which often, like myself, can be generations removed from them. So how can we reconnect? And how can we also recognize a saying you may have heard, that all are relations, which recognizes and understands that many First People, Native people, and Indigenous people are related, that we're cousins, that because we migrate and travel over different territory, there's often a lot of interchange between our cultures, interchange between our families, interchange between our practices, and it's not a monolith. We're not all one Indigenous people. So when you hear about tropes or stereotypes about, what we wear or our cultural protocols, ideas like, all Indigenous people burn sage, or all Indigenous people wear feathers. Those are very sometimes offensive to specific Native and First People, because it has this idea of pan-Indigenous, like all Indigenous people are the same. And of course, we have a very rich diversity with people having very specific customs and practices in their specific region. And that's what the land acknowledgement is a journey to get to that information and reconnect. Next slide. And I really want to lift up, we're doing this presentation very briefly. Normally this is like an hour. We're doing it in like 10, 15 minutes. That acknowledgements are not enough. Acknowledgements are just the first step in what we hope is a journey for you. It's not a single moment, but a movement and a commitment that we're asking you to do, especially as educators, to reconnect and help us reconnect our youth with their ancestors, with their relatives, with the relatives of First People, Native people, and Indigenous people around the globe. You can help us correct the untold history, correct the erasure and the invisibility that many Indigenous people face by lifting up these steps and living up to the saying, nothing about us without us, which means in order for you to really do the work of land acknowledgement and decolonization and helping to restore that history, you have to include the Indigenous, Native, and First Peoples that you're talking about in your classroom. So the first step is acknowledging the land, but the second step is figuring out who were the First Peoples and acknowledging those peoples. The third step is honoring them as the caretakers, understanding that many times the narrative in history and in the classroom is that, this was the wild, wild west, everything was wild. And that is not the truth. Many First Peoples and Native peoples took the land in what you would call permaculture today. There was controlled burns, there was consciousness about what plants were invasive species, which animals were struggling, what was going on with the water and the air quality, and so many other things that we now consider part of the modern day environmental movement. Indigenous people, Native people, and First People were doing these things for hundreds, maybe thousands of years before these lands were colonized. So understanding that people took this land and honoring that and showing respect for that. Land acknowledgements also help us connect and include their wishes. So as we start to connect, we hope for many of you, you'll be able to hear some of the speakers that we have invited here this weekend will help you connect with the local people of these lands, and so that you can really implement their wishes when you're talking about curriculum related to Native people, Indigenous people, and First People. The fifth step is learning their language, protocols, and customs. In that first slide where I mentioned Yuhaviatam, Serrano, and San Manuel Band of Mission Indians, many of you probably were familiar with San Manuel, but not Yuhaviatam, which is the actual name of their people in their tongue, or Serrano, depending on what time period and what region we're talking about. So it's important to reestablish their language by using and learning their language and not the modern language that we refer to today. Also, as we talked about, the protocols and customs, making sure that those are also accurate and respectful. It is very easy to do something that we think is innocent, and we can offend Native people and First People by not knowing the correct customs and protocols. And then finally, we hope over time you get to the sixth step, which is asking for permission and being a good guest. Understanding that the caretakers who are responsible for the land, we are guests on the land. And so that means we have an obligation and responsibility to be good guests, to be here with respect, taking care of Mother Earth, taking care of each other, and of course, recognizing the First People and Native people and their contributions. Next slide. So I have some resources for you. I know that was a lot that we threw at you. The best land acknowledgement kind of PDF that you can share is from the Meetsley Project. It's at Beatley Native Land. That's the author is Joel, who's out of Tongva territory in Los Angeles. Also a good example is the highdesert.com, which has a really great local land acknowledgement here for the region and gives a lot of great information about questioning why a land acknowledgement and how it's relevant to your curriculum or your activities or events. And then of course, the last link is the nativeland.ca link that we're going to be playing with a little bit right now. And so I'm going to pass the mic to Mary Walls so that she can talk to you about the Padlet and what kind of activity we're going to do with acknowledging Indigenous land, Native land, and First Peoples land in your region. Thank you.